one thing I kind of lay out is that meaning is tied to our ability to tell a comprehensive story about our lives and our role within our lives. And the market has this effect of complexifying everything and making it less obvious how we fit into this story of our lives. And in times in which my understanding was much more local and centered, I was able to take much greater meaning in my actions. Yeah, so a narrative for me is false if it doesn't change with our agency.
Benjamin Heaton, welcome on the podcast.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me.
You just finished writing a philosophy thesis.
Yeah, in the process of finishing, let's say.
And it's called Meaning in the Market.
Mm-hmm.
So that will be our topic today. Just as a bit of an introduction before we dive into the philosophy, because it will be quite an abstract conversation.
Mm-hmm.
We met last year in the summer at a philosophy summer school.
Yes.
And we quickly connected over just philosophy, I would say.
Exactly, yeah.
We began to hang out. And actually, isn't it the case that we already met at the reunion? Or not the reunion,
the introduction did. And then I think we had maybe one hangout between the introduction and the summer school, where we talked a lot about, I think we were getting to know each other and each other's philosophies.
Yes.
And then at the summer school, we spent a lot of time together. And then since, I think you've occupied a lot of my mental and philosophical space.
Yeah, I feel like a lot of this thesis was written in my bedroom.
Yeah, quite literally. So you're one of my main interlocutors here, and I think that's implicit in the thesis quite a bit.
Yeah, fun. So I'm excited to talk about it. I read the whole thesis yesterday. But again, before we start, maybe you could also give a bit of introduction to yourself.
Okay, something more practical. So I originally am from small town America. I've been living now in the Netherlands for almost 4 years, where I came to do my studies after kind of a first failed study in America, some time off during COVID, working and whatnot, and then kind of spontaneous decision to come to the Netherlands, and where I've been studying economics and philosophy. Yeah, other than that, I don't know. I have a lot of strange hobbies. But it's strange to talk about myself in this sense. It seems continuous, but maybe a lot of it needs to be explained.
Mm.
Yeah.
What was the reason for you to study philosophy?
Well, I've always been kind of adjacent to philosophy, and I think I was left very unfulfilled by my degree in economics, because I really wanted to engage deeply in the topics that I consider important, like meaning, for instance, and how it's connected to, the economy, the market, etc. And in economics, we never got there. We just stayed on this very shallow level, and I was always kind of perturbed by that and looking for more. And I found that, at least to some degree, in philosophy.
To some degree, but not entirely.
And not entirely. I think philosophy is still very academic.
Mm-hmm.
And one thing that's really essential to my philosophy, and I think it's implicit in this thesis, is it's something to be enacted and challenged against the environment and against others, and against yourself. But it's one thing to think of something, but it has to be kind of colored by experience, in my view.
Mm-hmm.
And philosophy schools do that maybe to some degree, but a lot of the I think the most profound philosophers that I know, that I've met, never studied philosophy, and they were kind of the people who just think deeply about problems in their local environment, and are willing to engage with others on this deeper level, and that to me is real philosophy.
Cool. Okay, so shall we dive in?
Let's.
So, Meaning and the Market is the professional title of your thesis.
Very bold.
Indeed. Could you explain how you see meaning in the market?
Yeah. So one thing I kind of lay out is that meaning is tied to our ability to tell a comprehensive story about our lives and our role within our lives. And the market has this effect of complexifying everything and making it less obvious how we fit into this story of our lives. And so that's where the title comes from, at least. But again, that's still very it's not exactly yet what the thesis is about.
Yeah, so maybe one thing that we can do is define the terms of your thesis, because you use some quite specific terminology, and you have specific meanings for them.
Yeah.
So could you explain what are the terms you use and what do they mean?
Yeah, and they don't necessarily correspond to the way they're typically used. It makes it a bit more confusing.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's best to start with narrative. Maybe that comes back to a lot, and I now it's entered also my everyday lexicon, which has become annoying for a lot of people. But I use narrative to kind of refer to the stories, the literal stories, but also the figurative stories that we understand about the world in order to make sense of it. And this is, it could be something as simple as like knowing a story that literally about how something works. But these are literal in the sense that you've experienced them, and they can give you this kind of the narratival understanding. And I also use the word narrative to define the narrative, the grand narrative of your life. So the kind of I guess suppose the entire story of your life and how you fit into it, how other people fit into it, the roles that they play. But importantly, narrative, the micro narratives, these kind of smaller everyday stories, I think is very closely connected to agency, which is the capacity, but also the will to act. So narratives grant us the capacity to act because you can tell stories about how things work, but they also give you a reason to do certain things. And this is closely related again to these macro narratives, the grand narrative, the story of your life. And if you have both the capacity to do something and also the reason to do something, that is what I call agency.
Yes.
Yeah. Maybe another term that's important to define right away is whole, or totality, which is different than this kind of macro narrative. Maybe it's more closely defined as the setting, and it's your comprehension of society, let's say, or the environment more generally. But it's always imagined to some degree, and it's always changing, and it changes with your agency, because as you enact your agency, you're kind of pairing one-to-one your understanding, your narratival understanding, to what the actual environment is, and in doing so, you're also changing the environment. So your narrative grows, your understanding of the whole grows, and therefore your agency also grows. So these things are iterative and very connected. No. Maybe. I think those are the most, important to be defined terms.
Yeah. Okay. So we have narrative, agency, and whole or totality.
Mm-hmm.
So actually, right before the podcast, this was a question I wanted to ask you. Mm-hmm. I think it fits in. If we give a practical example, so you're talking about how the markets, our engagement with the markets makes it so that we can't understand the whole that we're living in. So let's say that I buy an iPhone. To some extent, the iPhone is indeed incomprehensible to me. It's consists of all these parts that I have no clue how they were created.
Black box, just
yes. On the other hand, it does afford me some local competence. Like I develop a relationship. Some would even say that in our modern day we're cyborgs, because the phone has become such a natural extension of our being. So our whole is, in a sense, our individual whole that there's a part added that we don't understand. And there's a part added where it actually where we do understand, in a sense, how it increases the narratives we tell it.
Yeah, indeed. But yes, so the iPhone is indeed a black box, but there are kind of capabilities that it affords you in the world. But this is, I think, true of everything. So, for instance, not an iPhone, but just a stick that you might use as a tool. You don't actually know how that works. No, you don't. Especially you don't know like the chemical composition of the stick. They give it some flexibility, but also remains turgid. It's that's unknown to you. You just kind of know how it acts in the world. But the difference in this sense between an iPhone and a stick is that it's easier to learn more deeply about this stick than I think it is to learn about the iPhone, because you can, you know where the stick comes from, and you can very easily, if you break the stick, you can maybe make a new one or craft it in a certain way, and you can see where the development comes from. And I think that's much less true with the iPhone. Kind of the abilities that it affords you are narrow, maybe, and guided, whereas with the stick, it's much more. You are maybe more of the main character. You determine what you do with the stick, whereas the iPhone, the capabilities are determined.
Yeah,
at least to an extent.
Yeah. Okay, that's interesting. That relates to, I think, at a certain point in your thesis, you talk about teleological narratives.
Yeah.
Could you explain what you mean by that?
Yeah. So a teleological narrative is a narrative that's guided to afford you a certain type of agency. So an understanding that is, determined for you to follow in order to keep your agency within certain bounds that are beneficial, not necessarily to you holistically, but to the system around you. The example that I came to use was an airport.
Mm-hmm.
And that our understanding in the airport is guided, for instance, by literal physical barriers, by maybe people explaining us where to go, where not to go, and rules that give us a certain amount of agency within the airport. But this understanding is guided. The narrative is guided to afford a certain type of agency.
Yes. And you compared the airport, I think, to the home.
Yeah, exactly. Where the home here is, at least I think a proper home is unguided, and is the goal of the home, so to speak, is just to provide maybe the general capacities to live a proper life, something much more up in the air. And here the understanding isn't guided, it's created, I think, more holistically and cohesively. For instance, if there's something that you want to accomplish in the home, or you want to have the home help you accomplish, maybe you change some of the plumbing or the electricity, and in doing so you kind of reveal the home to you, and you grow a different understanding. But as you pair your own understanding to the actuality of the home, your understanding grows to incorporate that. But it's not guided in any sense. In the agency that you're afforded by this grown understanding is unguided and, I think, more holistic, which is important for the grander comprehension of the whole, which comes back to the ability to find meaning in your actions. It requires this comprehension of the whole.
Okay. Yeah. I was indeed thinking about this example. I remembered when I was still traveling a lot to the United States and back for the Bible school. And at a certain point, the airports, or airport in general, because you always took a different airport as a transit, but they started to feel a bit homey.
Interesting.
Just because I was there a lot. So I was wondering about, on the one hand, you sketched this picture of the airport is very teleological, like very purpose driven. It's just like for quick transit of passengers. So there's very little that you can adapt about the environment. It's all just set up so that passengers quickly get on the plane, and without any disruptions. But yeah, there was for me that sense of feltness that it was almost as though the more I was at the airport, like maybe I felt freer to peek through the back door.
Yes.
The staff entrance.
So I do think that we're always trying to holistically understand our environment, so to like peek behind the walls, so to speak. But this is much more limited in the airport. So that it exists somewhere on the spectrum of incomprehensibility to us. It's a sort of maybe like a gray box, not black box. But with
Very gray.
With a home, you're, in a sense, your agency is unbounded by the structure, because you can, or it's much less bounded, that you can kind of do much more that would grow your understanding, such that you can do even more.
Yeah.
But in the airport, indeed, if you're comfortable with it, you'll get this sense of hominess, even in an airport you've never been in, because you already understand the structure that you can apply to an airport. It's globalized in some sense, that it exists everywhere, and for that exact reason, so that it's easy to understand that you have this certain type of agency in every airport. But it doesn't fit into, you're not able to completely understand the airport, or less completely than you might be able to understand a home. That if you try to, for instance, change something in an airport, you'll very quickly be stopped.
Yeah. Okay. So it's both our capacity to enact our agency, to use the technical terms, which would be this. Like when you try to change something, you'll be stopped. You don't have a lot of agency, a lot of freedom to alter things, whereas in the house you do. There's also this component where you can get this sense of hominess with airports, especially also because they're global phenomena, but they're still not as consistent a part of your individual life as the home is. Would that be right to say that that's also part of understanding the whole?
Yeah, I'm not sure if so. It is, even if it is a consistent part of your life, if you travel a lot, or if you work at an airport, for example, it's still not going to have the depth of understanding that I think would give you a more comprehensive picture of the whole.
Okay. So, but let's suppose that someone's whole family are workers at the airport. They have all kinds of different roles. This is a family airport.
Okay. Family run.
Yeah, family run airport. So you have your entire community there. You're there every day, maybe even more than you're at your home.
Maybe you live there.
Maybe you live there, or you run it together. What would that do? Because then there's still that element that an airport is more complex than a home. Although in your home you might not understand the plumbing, it's easier to understand plumbing than to understand the mechanics of an aerodynamic vehicle.
Yes. Yeah. Okay. So there's definitely a spectrum of I call it conduciveness to agency or understanding. If you and your family who you interact with daily live and work at the airport, you might understand it a bit more holistically, but there are still things, because it exists in this broader structure, that you'll be unable to understand, or say, because even if you live in the airport, you're bounded by a market structure in which you have to produce, or rather fly people all over the globe. Otherwise you'll be put out of business. So there are certain limitations to how you can understand, where you can put your resources of understanding. That it will still be, in a sense, teleological. Well, does this make sense?
It does make sense. I'm just wondering, still the comparison with the home, because so an airport has this teleological function, market driven, and the home doesn't have that. But if you put all the functions of the home in the airport, as we've sort of hypothesized with this family run airport, then you have all that plus the teleological function. So don't you just have a whole that's bigger and that you can come to? Or is there something intrinsic to this market drivenness, this some like capitalist competition, that makes it so that the whole is just intrinsically less understandable by the individual.
Yeah, it definitely makes the narratives more teleological. So, for instance, this airport / home from the movie Terminal, maybe it is somewhere between completely teleological and completely holistic. I'm not actually sure there's a perfect example of either, but it's just this connectedness to the market, which I think causes narratives to be teleological, because you're put in this like efficiency by competition scenario in which you are required to do certain things in order to exist, that it selects for a more teleological.
Yeah.
So the market has this effect of making the narratives more teleological, because we have to understand certain we have to have certain types of agency in order for the airport to be efficient enough to survive, whereas that's not the case in the perfect home per se. Maybe even in a relatively decent home there are still teleological narratives, but the more holistic I think it becomes, or the less teleological pressure from the market, the more holistic you'll understand the home, and the more holistic your agency will become.
Okay. So let's suppose, because I think this notion of meaning, that if your purpose, your teleology, your actions are steered in one direction by the markets, as I understand you're saying that this directiveness is decreases your capacity to make sense of the whole, and also sort of limits the scope of your agency that you can enact on. There's also Nietzsche, for example, talks about how we are mules, donkeys, we're beasts of burden. We need a burden to carry, otherwise we become lazy and all that. So in a sense, what if, for example, you really like, and we'll leave the airport example in a second, but what if you really like working at the airport, and sort of, or just more generally, the job that you are given by the market? Don't you think it can also give people actually this sense of meaning?
Yes, indeed, but only to an extent. And as soon as they leave the airport, this kind of maybe a facade of meaning crumbles, that their other actions are only meaningful kind of in relation to the airport. But I don't think this sense of meaning, maybe this beneficial burden that's given by the airport is as strong as it could be, because your actions are now only meaningful in relation to the success of the airport, and that as well your understanding of the whole changes. It leaves behind this kind of narrative of the airport, that your actions, or that rather the whole that you exist in, is bigger than the airport, like necessarily.
Right. Unless it's a family-run airport.
Maybe there's a family-run airport, but even still, the airport is still only a subsection of your whole. There's other people that you don't know come through the airport, and the food that you derive isn't from the airport. So it's still, the airport can never be the whole thing.
Okay. Yeah, it's interesting to think about which kind of systems could be family run in that sense. Airports might be less likely, whereas a local business, for example, is already closer to this integration.
A farm, but even like these larger family run businesses that interact with many people on a daily basis, they're constantly exposed to the fact that their whole, or rather this family run business is the whole is bigger than they are. So they're constantly bombarded with the fact that they don't fully understand their position within the whole. They see that it's bigger than just this business. This is relative, so this might be on this spectrum of that you're closer to understanding the whole comprehensively than, for instance, if you just worked as a someone without far from their family, just in a factory, but it's not as meaningful, I think, as it could be.
Okay, because it's still integrated in the markets.
Yeah.
Okay. So another idea that has been a sort of solution to this problem that has been circling in our circles is this idea of local communities. In your thesis, you also give this thought experiment of imagining a world with 10 distinct societies, each consisting of 100 to the 22nd power people. Sorry, that's a bad joke. But 10 distinct societies in a world with 100 people each.
Yeah.
So very small worlds, very small communities. Can you explain the thought experiment? What's the benefit of that way of living, would you say?
So the benefit, maybe I'll say it clearly and then point to it, is that your comprehension of the whole is is bounded. Well, sorry, maybe that's so. As you enact your agency in one of these wholes, it's much easier to see the results of that agency. And these, as the wholes complexify and you enact your agency, it becomes much more difficult to trace your contribution, because the whole is always one, but as the complexity of it grows. So, for instance, there are 100 people in a society. It's much easier to trace the effects of your agency as opposed to there being, 1,000 or 1,000,000, etc. So as society complexifies, the actual contribution of your impact on a person-to-person basis grows, but in relation to the whole, it diminishes.
Okay. You also talk about innovation in these type of communities. How do you, what do you see as the role of innovation in these type of communities?
So innovation kind of has this double edge, where as an innovator, so to speak, you're using your agency to change the whole, to change the lives of the individuals within that whole. And that gives you a sense of purpose because it's you interacting with the whole. But innovation has this tension between the other people in the society, whereas if you innovate, complexity of the whole increases, and their ability now to effectively use their agency in a meaningful way diminishes. It becomes more difficult to understand the society well enough to innovate. So in a society of 100 people, you kind of have this externality of against only the other 99. But in a society of 1,000,000 or 1,000, it's just the n-1. So the more innovators there are, the more difficult it is to innovate. And then the more difficult it is to understand the meaning of your action.
Yes. How this hits home for me is that, especially with being a musician and having social media, a lot of the times when there's a video of just a really good drummer, just one of two things tends to happen, and it kind of depends on the personality, it seems. So either the comments will be full of, this made me want to quit playing guitar forever. Yep. There's always that one person that's just way better. And on the other hand, there are the comments of like, wow, this really inspired me to get better. And there seems to be that I haven't quite figured out, because I know some internet personalities where it's more usually the comments are just on the side of, wow, this really inspired me. And for the others, there's just like, okay, I quit, I give up. And but there is that feeling of, wow, why would I get better? Why would I do a podcast, for example? Why would I learn how to drum if there's just so many people that are just so much better? And I think especially for me, when it's stuff that gets uploaded to social media, why would I upload a drum video to social media? Because that the 1 minute that they'll be watching me, they could be watching something that's just so much higher quality. And that definitely reduces the, it's also part of the reason why I stopped the podcast for a while. It's just because the self-criticism comparison with other podcasts. And so what you're saying, to draw back to the example, is that if you have smaller communities, not this globalized media environment, then there's the meaning of what you're producing is just more local. It's more, yeah.
I'm curious, did you experience both emotions? Are you both, inspired to drum more, or likewise, or are you also put off by the meaninglessness of it, maybe?
Yeah, it's a good question. Yeah, it's a good question. I haven't figured out yet what's the difference there. I do know that with drumming in particular, because I feel that I have some aanleg, some talent, so that if I work hard enough, then I can get to similar levels of competence. So maybe it has to do with that just feeling of that I would be able to get there.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas with the podcast, one of the thoughts that I had is that I just don't have that star personality, that internet personality that really would thrive as a podcast host. But the way that was sort of countered in my mind is by thinking that, well, I just really enjoy making podcasts.
Yeah, fair.
So, and I could imagine similarly with drums, because there are also some levels that I'll never reach, no matter how hard I work. So that's also not the entire thrust of the fact that I get motivated by watching certain drummers. It's also just the fact that I enjoy drumming. And also, if we're talking about sort of local impact, local meaning, music is one of those things, since it's universal. There will always be bands to apply to be part of, and to do performances here and there. And then so part of it is maybe this, if your pure focus becomes uploading to social media, then it's going to be a lot more just that comparison. But if you look locally, then
and being able to see maybe the impact of your drumming on the faces of an audience, without the kind of comparison. But there's this double edge here that I think is really interesting. So you said you're inspired to drum, maybe because you have some sort of talent. But if you were to actualize that talent, I think it would have the effect of making others who might also have this desire to be a very talented drummer. It would have this effect of putting them off, because now there's someone even more talented that I have to maybe improve on or differentiate myself from to another extent. But if you kept it local and you didn't upload it to social media, and you just enjoyed drumming in a local environment, it wouldn't have this adverse effect on all of this other people who would have been connected to your drumming.
Yes.
So there's a trade-off here between the experience of hearing a great drummer and the ability to find meaning in your drumming.
Mm-hmm.
That's kind of a trade-off I don't take a position on, but it's one that I think is important to explicate. Like, would we rather have the ability to listen to the best drummers in the world, or would we rather have the ability to find meaning in our drumming more easily?
Yes. Yeah. I think there is, another thing with the podcast specifically is that I didn't feel like advertising it as much because of this comparison. I felt that the quality wasn't at that level that it would be worth advertising, would be worth people's time to watch, especially people who don't know me.
Right.
Whereas with my drumming, I feel a bit different. I like that strangers watch and comment. But with the podcast, like, maybe that instinct to not want to advertise it too broadly is precisely the right instinct.
Right.
It keeps it local.
But does that instinct, do you think, come from the fact that there are such successful, good podcasters out there? But what there's another strange tension is that you might, had you not had this instinct or not seen these other podcasters, you might have had the potential to be an even greater podcaster, but you were afraid to develop, right, or to actualize this talent.
Yeah, and you quickly shift into the standard persona.
Yep.
Which I try very hard not to do.
Yeah.
I decided that the radio host or the podcast host is not a mask that I like.
No.
It does when I take it on, it does sort of facilitate certain capabilities, which I can appreciate. But I don't see it as
a bit inauthentic, maybe.
Yeah, inauthentic and not as fun. Like, I want a philosophical podcast where we're just talking.
Right. Would you want to be a famous drummer if you had to drum boring lines?
Right. Well, the best drummers are the ones who can really keep their capacity for riffs and fills, inside, are just playing the clean beats behind a Taylor Swift or a Justin Bieber. It's a massive respect for that. I also do in my drumming aspire to minimalism in a way that doesn't become non-complex. Like, it's possible to have complexity in a very minimal piece. Precisely, and in drumming it's very easy because everything is so extravagant and so many riffs, we think that that's great. Now there's a sort of a hole in the market for minimalism to be perceived as the cool thing to do. But there's also just hitting the accents at the exact right time or with a very heightened sense of intentionality,
right?
Where that adds a level of complexity to drumming and creativity as well.
But with drumming and podcasting, is they remain very isolated parts of your life. That they're not super connected to maybe other things that you find meaningful or other things that you're required to do in order to sustain yourself.
I don't know though, because the people I invite on my podcasts are friends and people in my direct environment. And so it gives someone who's directly in my environment, it gives us something to bond over, to refer back to watch back.
Indeed.
It gives me a sort of an historical anchor point with them that I can in 20 years even look back at.
Yep.
So in that sense, it is pretty connected.
Yep.
And part of what would make me want to grow the podcast in popularity online is that it opens up avenues to speak with other podcasters. Yep. So in that sense, it broadens your environment and your circle.
Yeah, but I do think that there's an exception, and I agree that it's this kind of process of embedding your actions within other parts of your life that make it meaningful, like the layering of the story and these other connections to stories throughout your life make it meaningful. But I think that's the exception. You do these things out of your own passion, but there are so many things in our life that we do simply out of necessity, or that are very disconnected from these other stories that we tell in these other parts of our lives. And that, I think, is is an adverse effect of the market, that it's spreading out our narrative such that they no longer intersect and embed.
Yes. So at the end of your thesis, this reminds me of something you say, I am given much hope by those who I have seen intentionally take a step back, shrink their world, and try to regrow their narratives from the ground up. So do you see things around you where there is this this shrinking of the world or this way of making meaning that you're sort of proposing?
Yeah, it's kind of consciously reducing your whole. There is such a large allure to these these kind of modes of these understandings that bestow an agency that is widely applicable and maybe lucrative, maybe prestigious, but I think depth of meaning that they provide is always going to be very limited. Where if you do these things that are a bit more small scale, communing with friends, starting a more bare bones life that is much less connected to the world, I think that is the recipe for, once again, finding meaning in your actions. When you're able to embed the things you do in your daily life, and you're able to connect them to stories more broadly. So it's moving to a place where your actions overlap where for instance, podcasting isn't about these things that you maybe don't understand, but is also about your friends or places where it intersects with other stories you can tell. And I do think that can be done consciously, but that's something that I didn't explore too fully in my thesis. That was originally my hope, but I simply ran out of words.
It happens very quickly with a bachelor's thesis. Yeah. 10,000 words seems like a lot, but it fills up quickly.
Yeah, I think I could have written twice that. I actually substantially went over my limit already. So.
Is there something I wanted to ask? So Nietzsche popularized the idea that every philosophy is rooted in the instinct of the philosopher.
Yeah.
What's the genealogy of this thesis? Is there something that happened in your own life that you saw as a pattern, or some events that steered you towards this topic?
Yeah, I think indeed. So there are definitely things in my life that I find more or less meaningful, and there are things that I'm more or less good at, or things that are more or less, say, important to do. And there's a growing, I feel, discrepancy between what's required of me and what I find meaningful. And in times in which my understanding was much more local and centered, I was able to take much greater meaning in my actions. So I think kind of a strange example is COVID, where everyone kind of was forced to reconvene in a local environment. All of my actions made sense. So I spent most of COVID working at construction, very generally. But it was interesting because I could see how the things that I built impacted the relationships of people around me. So I worked for my neighbor for a time. I did some construction around the house where I was able to host my friends. And so all of a sudden, the stones that I was laying to make a patio, for instance, were connected to the later on to the experiences we had on that patio with friends during COVID, and all of a sudden the mundane actions that I also experienced before COVID, working for a firm where I would maybe build a better deck or patio or whatever, but they just didn't overlap with anything that I cared about.
Yeah.
So the same process of this kind of what I previously considered menial labor, just leveling and digging, and all of a sudden were colored when I knew that it was connected to all of these other things. So it's in the sense it comes from that's at least the start of the experience, and I wanted to understand why that was. Because there's when something you're doing is meaningful and connected, and it's increasingly become the exception. And we try to convince ourselves that something we're doing is meaningful, but there's a lot of cognitive dissonance required, and sometimes you snap out of it and you just, oh my gosh. And then but I don't think that has to be the case. I really don't.
Yeah, very interesting. It's I noticed this a relatively short time ago when I was in Tilburg for 3 days, with just surrounded by friends the whole time, and everything we did was together. We were still studying for school, but that was also together, and we were talking in between, and just the level of grounding that I felt during those days. When I came back here in Rotterdam, I just felt like I everything around here was dead. Gray, cold. It's like, what am I doing here?
Right.
So then the scales fell offwards.
But even though you've lived there for how many years?
Yeah, 8 years.
Yep.
Roughly. Yeah, 8 years.
And there are plenty of stories to tell about Rotterdam for me as well, but I think the fact that they don't overlap,
yes,
so they're not connected to one another, makes things, makes it much more difficult to find the meaning in things. Because this is one of the things that I alluded to in this conclusion about, consciously reducing the size of our holes, was this group in Tilburg where where it was, I think, consciously embedding or bringing the stories to the focal point being this locality, which makes what might be, for instance, mundane studying, if you were to do it in a disconnected manner, much more colorful and enjoyable and purposeful. But I think this is exactly the type of life we used to live, and that this kind of disconnected path is become the exception.
Mm-hmm.
That's something I tried to explore.
Maybe we can discuss. You studied engineering for a year. Gave you some. Wasn't entirely a thrown away year, since it gave you some mathematical
yes,
skills.
Indeed. So I don't know if it's a blessing or a curse, but now I like to mathematize everything to make sense of it, just to really clearly define everything. And I was able to use that a little bit here.
Yeah, maybe we can run through the formulas that you've created, and then I have some questions along the way.
Okay.
So the first one is M equals A times W. Yep. And then there's some things in between the brackets. So could you explain that formula?
Yep. So this is a formula for meaning, mm-hmm. but not not in a reductive sense. I'm trying to capture the proportionality of how you find your action, which is A in this equation, your agency, meaningful. And so the meaning you find in your agency is proportional to the actual impact of your agency on the whole A times your ability to comprehend the whole W. Very simply. Yeah. So that's the first grid. This is the proportionality of how you're able to find meaning in your action. That was explicated in the example that as your whole complexifies, as there is more innovation, so to speak, that it's more difficult to trace your actions, your agency back to how it affects the whole comprehensively.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you also have a formula for this, which is roughly, W equals B over 1 plus S. Yeah.
So this is just to show that your comprehensibility of the whole W is inversely proportional to the actual complexity of society. So
right.
S.
Because the B stands for your narrative capacity.
Yeah, which is just kind of a catch-all term to define how one person is able to spin narrative, to narrate their whole. So it captures a lot of things, but namely the individual ability to narrate.
Yeah. And as I understood it, you take this individual capability to narrate to be a constant.
Yeah, just mostly for the sake of the
equation.
The equation, otherwise it would get really tricky.
Yeah.
There are a few assumptions I have to make in order to make the math worthwhile in a sense. Otherwise it would just get too complicated. So a few of them are like the societal complexity at the start is 0, or that all acts of agency are only increase societal complexity. Another one that is important to, I think, to talk about, but for the purposes of this equation and not so important to clearly define, is that agency and the whole are, and your understanding of the whole are mutually determined. So they're as you enact your agency, your comprehension of the whole betters, and vice versa. As your comprehension of the whole betters, the more agency you have. So that's an important dynamic, but for the purposes of the of the conclusion that I'm trying to really highlight, the conclusion being that as the whole complexifies, your ability to find meaning in your actions diminishes, and that there's a tension between agency, individual agency, and the ability of others in the environment to find meaning in their actions.
Right.
For that conclusion, this iterative development isn't as important, but for other conclusions later on it is.
Yeah. Yeah, that would, in my mind, that would have made it very difficult to mathematize this formula, like especially this tension between the individual enacting their agency and how it relates to the whole,
Yep.
versus how the individual enacting their agency relates to other people being able to enact their agency.
Yep.
And understand the whole. So yeah, the next formula, is this sum essentially that as complexity increases, complexity increases with the amount of agency that's enacted. That's how I read it.
Yeah, so it's broadly accurate. So this is just to show that societal complexity is developed by all agents over time. So for every action, for every active agency that someone instantiates, societal complexity will increase. Of course, that's an assumption, but I think it's a pretty defensible assumption. And this is true of over time and through individuals, which is why it's a sum and also an integral. Of course, this is just a kind of more of a stylistic choice, but I think these assumptions are defensible.
Yes, and even if it were only the case that there are more individual actions that complexify the whole than there are that reduced complexity, then you've already a case that individual agency complexifies the whole in the long term.
Yeah, there's also some embedded also in the math is that, for instance, that all acts of agency complexify and that they're kind of ubiquitous and spread evenly and they're instantaneous. These are things you can maybe add to the model to complexify it, but again, for the conclusions that I make, aren't really necessary.
Yeah. What is the way, maybe we already discussed it previously, but what's the way in which complexity might decrease?
So naturally, just via entropy, and this kind of decay also make an argument that some acts of agency will decrease complexity. But just via nature, that things decay, complexity decays back into this, a natural state, that the enhancements we make in the world eventually crumble.
Yeah. So just natural decay. If things aren't upkept, maintained, then they decay. Yeah. This thing will take a long time to decay.
Yeah, indeed. But maybe a lifetime, which is about as So I argue if something decays within a lifetime, then it doesn't affect the next person's ability to find meaning in their agency, their actions.
How do you mean that?
If, for instance, you make an enhancement which gives you meaning in your life and the lives of others, that this complexity, as long as it decays by the birth of the next individual, that it won't be a barrier for them to find their own meaning in their action.
Right. Yeah, you give an example also of this this decay of complexity with hunger and food. Could you elaborate on that example?
Yeah, so we enact our agency, so to speak, in order to satiate ourselves. And then every day this satiation decays back into hunger, which is a problem, but it's a problem that gives us another chance at meaning, for us to craft a new meaningful story about finding a new way to satiate our hunger, and it gives us the chance to use our agency to solve a new problem and to develop our understanding of the environment, which is very important. So I think every time you, for instance, need to cook a meal or need to go find food, it's another interaction with the environment where you're using your narratives that you've derived from all of these previous times, from doing exactly the same. You're building, you're further building them through your agency, because there's always going to be a discrepancy between your understanding of the world and your narrative of it. You're weaving a new narrative every time you your satiation decays into hunger. You're forced to. So if we, for instance, solved the problem of hunger, and you were never hungry anymore, you would lose these opportunities to grow your narratives, enact your agency, and create a more holistic understanding of your environment, which is important for which you need to be able to tell a comprehensible story, brand narrative where you fit and play a prominent role.
So in a sense, we need this decay, we need this breaking down of the complexity and the holes that we're situated in.
Exactly. In order for us to, afford the ability to use our agency, or the need to use our agency, and grow our narratives, and grow this kind of macro narrative, which gives our actions meaning.
And that, of course, tends directly antithetical to the progress motive in capitalist society.
Exactly.
And I think it also relates to Hannah Arendt, who is another thinker that you cover in your thesis, your concept of natality. Could you explain how it relates to that?
I bring Hannah Arendt in to kind of criticize the notion that we should be protecting from this decay. So she talks about the natality, which for her is the kind of the inherent newness and the inherent destruction that comes with creation, which she sees as a positive force, but she also talks about our necessity to defend against this destruction in order to have proper political lives, which give us meaning. But which for her give us meaning. But this is where I disagree with her. Is I think you need to have this decay in order to comprehensively understand your whole, such that you can find meaning in your actions. So she, in my opinion, overemphasizes the destructive nature of decay, whereas decay also gives kind of the nutrients for other meaningful moments of agency, and for other people to find their agency, or to find meaning in their agency.
Yeah, interesting. So another thing that would be interesting to cover is something that Jordan Peterson says about narratives, because part of your move towards this term, it was inspired by Peterson's philosophy. Is that correct?
Definitely. I watched his lecture series at a formative age.
When you were doing construction.
Yeah, at the same time.
Yeah. So we've talked about this a few times. Maybe you want to explain the layers of meaning and how your own conception of that differs.
Yes. So, in my estimation, Peterson kind of talks about this meaning as well predefined, maybe like top down. So our actions are given meaning. We can always just why we're doing something, and this spirals up to maybe this ultimate reason, maybe the good. But for my conception, it's us who create the reason, so to speak. So it's our actions within the whole, and this kind of tension between the individual agency and the whole that determine why we do certain things. Because for Jordan Peterson, it's very universal and I think biological. But I grant a little bit more maybe leeway in this, so that what's good or the reason for doing something isn't necessarily innate to humans, but it's particular to the individual within their whole.
Yeah, the relationship between the individual and their environment.
Right. So it's what someone might find meaningful in one whole may be completely different to what's meaningful in another, just on the basis of the relationship between the individual and the whole.
Yeah, it's interesting, because the argument that Jordan Peterson makes is that there are some universal factors there in what we find meaningful. So the example, and maybe we even placed a clip Peterson in here. But the example is essentially, if you're writing an essay at school, then you can ask yourself why you're writing the essay. And at first, at face value, it seems like you're writing it to get a good grade. So you can keep going. Why do you want a good grade? Because you want to be a good student. You want to be a good student because you want to be a good citizen. You want to be a good citizen because you have some notion of what it means to be a good person. And this shades into the religious. And so your conception of it is that meaning doesn't, or how would you, maybe you can best explain.
So I agree that there are maybe some inherent structures that determine what we find meaningful, and maybe in like the Jungian sense that there's underlying biology that maybe sketch out very broadly the stories that are important to us. But I think a lot more of that is constructed by our relationship with the whole. So the whole gives us kind of a the setting in which to build the narrative of our lives. But yeah, why an essay might be meaningful might have a very different answer in one whole than in another. But in some wholes, it's much more obvious, I would say. So the answers to the questions become much more quickly get to the kind of end.
Yeah.
Maybe like pseudo-religious answer than in others.
Yeah.
And you don't have to go through as long of a process of this, in some senses, dissonance to get to a meaningful answer. Like, why are you building this patio? So to earn money. Why are you earning money? Because I want to provide for my family. Why do you want to provide? Whereas, why am I building this now? And there's only maybe one or two steps of differentiation between why it's important for you.
Yeah. I've noticed this when I became a non-believer. When I was a believer, and a lot of my believing friends think that meaning comes from sort of the notion of the afterlife, or meaning in the grander scheme of God and where you're going after you die. And so I got the question a lot when I no longer believed, like, well, where do you get your meaning? Do you still experience life as meaning? And I arrived quite quickly at the feeling that actually not much of my meaning had dissipated. Actually, I found a lot more meaning in my immediate environment and my connections. It was my family, my job, and all this. So instead of scaling up the narratives to like with the whys, because there's another problem is, well, a lot of the times we can't answer the whys. We don't know what's our next why. A lot of people haven't thought about what's their notion of the good. I couldn't explicate what's my notion of the good. I could say it's some sort of feeling, some sort of sense, but that sense does not shade into something explicitly religious.
Right.
That I could, but it's relational. It's tied up to indeed like how my environment functions.
Right.
So morality is a social issue more so than a objective universal issue, as I see it.
I think it might be a very broad claim, but I think you can say that this is, existentialism to some extent is our inability to tie our actions to this whole. In a lot of cases, religion has been the answer, but religion also doesn't fully capture the whole. You learn things about the environment that maybe contradict the religious understanding of the whole. So if you deconvert, maybe you're in this sense, you're switching all definitions of the whole, and you can still find meaning in your actions, perhaps even more meaning in certain actions that aren't tied to this end of being religious, but now we're tied to the whole. And our whole is complex, so it's still hard to answer these questions, but it's in another sense more real than the religious understanding of the whole.
Yep. for me, it definitely shifted the focus.
Yeah. So I think what I'm trying to answer is like, what might a whole look like where, well, it's more comprehensible than, well, maybe the religious is one extreme, but then this kind of current whole that we exist in, where we see that everything is interconnected, but we don't understand how and how we fit in and how our actions fit in. Maybe there's a hole in which, yeah, which the answers were more obvious to these questions of why.
Yeah, you talk about religious worldview and ideologies as false narratives. Could you explain how you see that?
Yeah, so a narrative for me is false if it doesn't change with our agency. So as we enact our agency, we're comparing our narratival understanding to what is real to some extent, to what it's at least bound to the world. But a false narrative doesn't change with our agency. So our understanding might grow, but this the whole that we're tied to, this false sense doesn't. And then the discrepancy between our understanding and this false narrative grow. And then there's like this layer of a lot of cognitive dissonance, I would say, to remaining to this whole, that the sense of the whole that isn't changing. It's very static. Whereas a whole, I think in the cohesive sense, grows with the individual. So the individual has some agency, so to speak, in what is meaningful, and vice versa. It's really a dualistic. In the false narrative, it's one way. It's top down.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Interesting. There are such things as process theology, this notion that God's revelation is continuing to unfold in history, and that continues to this day. And there you do see that there, well, these theological streams are sort of able to update the worldview, the religious narrative to more modern day. But there's of course a problem of relativism there. But I have always found a lot of I like this perspective. It's it's a very Jungian idea also that he what's the quote? The history of mankind is the incarnation of the divine. And what he essentially means by that is that God, it's not just that humans are trying to understand more and become more, in that sense, connected to the whole or to connected to God, but it's also that God is trying to understand humanity, he's trying to incarnate.
Indeed.
And so it's this
two-way.
Yeah. So, and then there's of course a very linear progression implicit in that idea, whereas you could also say that there might be some that we might understand less nowadays than we used to.
Yeah, indeed.
So,
or less holistically, maybe.
Was there anything else that you wanted to highlight from your thesis?
What might be nice is the question that I really intended to explore was kind of reducing the market's teleological nature by kind of, well, first consciously stepping back and shrinking our holes, but also by providing, well, alternatives such that we can do what we find meaningful and then rebuild our narratives such that they overlap in a meaningful way. And I think that has to be done with some assurances outside of the market. That's kind of the suggestion, maybe my next thesis, who knows. But I think that's a nice, less bleak conclusion of, or interpretation of the thesis, because the other one is just, we should just bring on the apocalypse, because at least that would be meaningful.
And the apocalypse, would that be, for example, degrowth? Is that the sort of apocalyptic?
No, I think that this is more the others. So there's the apocalypse would be if the market collapsed, and then we're left with these kind of teleological narratives and non-comprehension of the whole that doesn't provide our actions with meaning, and that we'd have to regrow. We'd have to regrow these our understanding of the world, which would grant meaning, but would cause a lot of pain in that process. Where I think degrowth is exactly this conscious stepping back and doing what we find meaningful and growing our understanding that way.
Yeah. Okay. Well, when you finish your second thesis, we can discuss that then. Yeah, you'll probably write a book about this one day.
Who knows? Yeah.
Great. Well, thank you for coming on the podcast.
No, thank you for having me.
You're welcome. It was very interesting. And thank you everyone for listening. And leave some comments with some likes.
Yeah, not too harsh, please.
All right. Thank you.